My name is Marlene. I'm 34 years old, and I'm standing in a courtroom watching my own parents sue me for my $2 million beach villa in Malibu. My mother's voice is ice cold as she tells the judge, "That house should go to your sister, not you." I can barely breathe as the weight of their betrayal crushes down on my chest. This isn't some business dispute or neighbor's quarrel. These are the people who raised me, who were supposed to love me unconditionally, now sitting across from me with their lawyer, treating me like an enemy they need to destroy. I never imagined my parents would become my enemies, but that morning in court, I realized they always had been. Before we dive into how I ended up in this nightmare, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments because I want to know where my story is reaching. And if you've ever dealt with toxic family drama, hit that like button right now so I know I'm not alone. Make sure you subscribe because what happened next is going to blow your mind. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this all played out. Now, let me take you back to where this horror story really began. Growing up in suburban Ohio, I learned early that love in my family was conditional, and I didn't meet the conditions. My parents, Gerald and Constance, made it crystal clear from the moment my sister Bethany was born that she was their masterpiece, and I was just the rough draft they wanted to forget. Bethany had golden curls that bounced when she laughed, bright green eyes that sparkled with mischief, and a personality that could charm anyone within 30 seconds. She was their little princess, their pride and joy, the daughter they'd always wanted. I, on the other hand, was the bookish, introverted older sister, with mousy brown hair, and a preference for libraries over parties. I was the disappointment they barely tried to hide. The differences in how they treated us weren't subtle. When Bethany turned 7, my parents threw her a birthday party that looked like something out of a magazine, complete with a rented pony, a professional magician, and a 3-tiered princess cake that cost more than our monthly grocery bill. When I turned 9 that same year, my mother bought a supermarket sheet cake the morning of my birthday and forgot to write my name on it. The candles were left over from Bethany's party. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, looking at that generic cake while my parents sang a half-hearted happy birthday, their eyes already drifting to Bethany, who was pouting because the attention wasn't on her. That was the moment I understood that in their eyes, I would never matter as much as she did. The pattern continued relentlessly through my childhood. My parents attended every single one of Bethany's dance recitals, sitting in the front row with bouquets of roses and video cameras, cheering so loudly you could hear them over the music. Meanwhile, I won first place at the regional science fair 3 years in a row, and my parents didn't show up once. They were always too busy, too tired, or had some excuse about Bethany needing them for something more important. My father, Gerald, would look at my award certificates with barely concealed disinterest and say the words that became his favorite refrain. "That's nice, Marlene, but why can't you be more like your sister? She knows how to make people happy." The implication was clear. My achievements meant nothing because I wasn't the daughter they wanted. By the time I reached high school, I'd stopped expecting anything from them. I worked 3 part-time jobs, juggling shifts at a local diner, a bookstore, and weekend babysitting gigs, saving every single penny I earned. While Bethany was getting weekly allowances for doing nothing and receiving expensive gifts just for existing, I was learning the value of money the hard way. I knew my only escape from that house was education, so I poured everything into my studies. When I got a full scholarship to Stanford for computer science, I thought maybe, just maybe, my parents would finally see me. I thought they might be proud. Instead, my mother barely looked up from her magazine when I told her. "That's far away," was all she said. My father just grunted. 3 days later, Bethany announced she was enrolling at the local community college to study art history, and my parents threw a celebration dinner, inviting all the relatives and bragging about how their youngest daughter was pursuing her passion. The real knife in the back came when I discovered what they'd done with my college fund. My grandmother, my father's mother, had been the only person in that family who ever saw me for who I was. Before she died when I was 16, Shed set up a small college fund for me, about $20,000 Shed saved over years. It wasn't a fortune, but it was her way of telling me she believed in me. My parents were trustees of that fund until I turned 18. 2 months before I left for Stanford, Bethany got engaged to Trevor, a charming musician with no job, no prospects, and a smile that could convince people to hand over their wallets. My parents were thrilled, calling him the son they never had. They threw Bethany an engagement party that cost thousands. And when I asked about accessing my college fund to help with books and housing deposits, my mother got defensive. "We had to borrow that money for Bethany's wedding," she said, as if it was the most reasonable thing in the world. You have a scholarship. You don't need it. Your sister's wedding is more important. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. That money was mine, left specifically for me by the one person who'd loved me unconditionally, and they'd stolen it to fund a party for their favorite daughter. When I told them I expected to be paid back, my father laughed in my face. Family helps family, Marlene. Stop being so selfish. That word, selfish, became their weapon of choice whenever I dared to stand up for myself. I was selfish for wanting my own money, selfish for going to school across the country, selfish for not being more grateful for the roof they'd put over my head for 18 years. The message was clear. Everything I had, everything I achieved, should belong to them, and by extension to Bethany. I left for Stanford 2 weeks later, and didn't speak to any of them for 2 years. It was the most peaceful 2 years of my life. Stanford became my sanctuary, the place where for the first time in my life, I was valued for my mind and my work, rather than judged for not being Bethany. I threw myself into computer science with an intensity that worried my roommates but felt necessary to me. Every line of code I wrote, every algorithm I mastered, was proof that I was worth something, that I could build a life that had nothing to do with my family's twisted values. I graduated at the top of my class, with multiple job offers, from major tech companies in Silicon Valley. I chose a mid-sized firm that specialized in artificial intelligence. And from day one, I was hungry to prove myself. I worked 16-hour days, weekends, holidays, anything to climb that corporate ladder. While my former classmates were enjoying their 20s, going to parties and traveling, I was in conference rooms and coding marathons, building my expertise. By the time I turned 28, I'd been promoted 4 times, and was leading a team developing cutting-edge AI software. That's when lightning struck. I'd been working on a side project, an algorithm that could optimize neural networks in ways that existing technology couldn't touch. It was elegant, revolutionary, and when I presented it to my company's board, they didn't fully grasp what they were looking at. They offered me a small bonus and wanted to absorb it into their existing product line. I knew this algorithm was worth so much more, so I did something terrifying. I quit my 6-figure job, cashed out my retirement savings, and started my own company. I called it Neural Wave Technologies, and I brought in Vincent, a brilliant business strategist I'd worked with, as my co-founder. Vincent became more than a business partner. He was the first person who believed in my vision as much as I did, who saw my potential, and never compared me to anyone else. The first year was brutal. We worked out of a tiny shared office space, lived on ramen and coffee, and pitched to every investor who would give us 5 minutes. Most turned us down. But then we landed a meeting with a venture capital firm that understood what we were building, and they gave us our first $2 million in funding. With that money, we refined the algorithm, built a prototype, and started landing contracts with major tech companies who needed our solution. Within 18 months, Neural Wave Technologies went from a scrappy startup to a company that every major player in Silicon Valley wanted to acquire. When the offers started coming in, Vincent and I had long conversations about what we wanted. We'd built something incredible, but we also knew that selling at the right moment could change our lives forever. At 32 years old, I signed the papers to sell Neural Wave Technologies for $48 million. My share after taxes and paying investors came to just over $30 million. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office, looking at the bank transfer confirmation, and feeling completely numb. I'd done it. I'd built something from nothing, proved every doubter wrong, and secured financial freedom for the rest of my life. The first thing I did was pay off Vincent's student loans as a thank you for believing in me. The second thing I did was start looking for a home that would symbolize everything I'd overcome. I found it 3 months later, a stunning beachfront villa in Malibu that took my breath away the moment I walked through the door. The villa was a modern masterpiece of glass and steel, perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean with an infinity pool that seemed to spill right into the sea. It had 5 bedrooms, each with ocean views, an open-concept living area with floor-to-ceiling windows, and private access to a secluded beach below. The price was $2 million, which felt surreal to pay in cash, but the moment I signed those papers and got the keys, I felt something I'd never experienced before. I felt like it arrived. This house was mine, bought with money I'd earned through my own intelligence and hard work, and nobody could ever take that away from me. It was proof that I didn't need my family's approval or love to succeed. I'd done it all on my own terms. In a moment of weakness, or maybe hope, I sent my parents a photo of the villa. Part of me still wanted their approval, still wanted them to say they were proud of me. Their response came 3 days later via text from my mother. Nice. Bethany just had her third baby. When are you settling down? No congratulations. No acknowledgement of what it achieved. Just another reminder that in their eyes, nothing I did would ever measure up to Bethany's choices. I felt that old familiar sting, the one I thought I'd outgrown. But I pushed it down and told myself I didn't care anymore. I had everything I needed. I didn't need them. But that lie I told myself was about to come back and destroy me in ways I never could have imagined. 6 months after I bought the villa, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in over a year. It was my mother, Constance, and her voice had a warmth to it that I didn't recognize. Marlene, sweetheart, I know we haven't been close, and that's on us. Your father and I have been doing a lot of thinking, and we realize we've been horrible parents to you. We want to make amends. We want to be a real family again. I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, not trusting what I was hearing. My mother had never apologized for anything in her life. She continued, her voice thick with what sounded like genuine emotion. Thanksgiving is coming up. Would you let us come to your beautiful new home? Just family, a chance to heal and start over. Please, Marlene, give us a chance to show you we've changed. Every instinct I had screamed that this was a trap, that people like my parents didn't just suddenly transform into loving relatives. But there was this small, wounded part of me, the little girl who'd spent her whole life wanting her parents to love her, that whispered maybe, just maybe, they really had changed. I talked to Vincent about it, and he encouraged me to give them a chance. People can grow, he said, and you deserve to have family who appreciates you. Maybe this is real. So against my better judgment, I agreed. I spent weeks preparing for Thanksgiving, hiring caterers, decorating the villa, buying gifts for Bethany's children I'd never met. I wanted everything to be perfect, wanted to show them that I could host a beautiful family holiday, that I was worthy of being part of their lives. When they arrived the day before Thanksgiving, the sight of them walking up my driveway felt surreal. Gerald had more gray in his hair. Constance had aged in ways that made her look harder, and Bethany arrived with Trevor and 3 small children in tow. For the first day, everything seemed magical in a way I'd never experienced with my family. My parents walked through the villa with what looked like genuine awe, complimenting the design and the view. Constance hugged me and said, "You've done so well for yourself, sweetheart. We're so proud of you." Those words, the ones I'd waited my entire life to hear, should have filled me with joy. Instead, they left me feeling uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. Bethany seemed friendly, asking about my work, and actually listening to my answers, playing with her kids on the beach, while I watched from the deck. But by the second day, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. I caught Gerald in my home office, supposedly looking for the bathroom, but he was standing at my desk where I'd left some property documents. When I walked in, he jumped slightly and smiled too wide. "Just admiring your setup," he said. But I saw him slip his phone into his pocket, in a way that suggested he'd been taking photos. Constance kept asking oddly specific questions about how I'd purchased the house, whether it was in my name alone, if I'd had help with the down payment. Just curious about the real estate market out here, she'd say, with a laugh that sounded forced. And Bethany, I caught her coming out of my office late one night when she thought I was asleep, claiming she was looking for aspirin. On the third night, I couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, so I got up to get water, and heard voices coming from the guest room where my parents were staying. I stood in the hallway, hidden in shadows, and listened to a conversation that shattered whatever hope I'd been holding on to. Bethany's voice came first, sharp and bitter. "This house is wasted on her. She doesn't even have a family to fill it with. It should be mine. I actually have children who could use this space." Then my father's voice, low and calculating. "The plan is working perfectly. Our lawyer says we have a solid case. We just need to document everything, show that we contributed to her success." My mother's response made my blood run cold. "She owes us for raising her. We gave her life. This house should belong to Bethany. She deserves it more." I stood frozen in that hallway, feeling like the floor was dropping out from beneath me. This whole reunion, the apologies, the warmth, all of it, had been a calculated performance, designed to gather information they could use against me. I wanted to burst into that room and confront them, but something stopped me. If they were planning something legal, I needed to be smart about this. I needed evidence. So I pretended I'd heard nothing, went back to my room, and for the rest of their stay, I played the role of happy, grateful daughter while watching everything they did. I noticed Gerald photographing documents when he thought I wasn't looking. I saw Constance going through my mail. I caught Trevor, Bethany's husband, taking video of the property on his phone. When they left after Thanksgiving weekend, all hugs and promises to stay in touch, I felt sick to my stomach. I immediately went through my office and discovered that several personal documents had been photographed, including financial records ID left in a drawer. They'd accessed my laptop briefly, though my passwords had stopped them from getting far. But what terrified me most was finding evidence that they'd gone through my filing cabinet where I kept personal financial statements and property records. They'd been systematic and thorough, gathering ammunition for whatever they were planning. I called Vincent immediately, and his response was grim. "They're building a case against you. You need to lawyer up now, before whatever they're planning hits." I thought I was being paranoid. I thought maybe I was overreacting. 2 weeks later, I was served with lawsuit papers, and I realized I hadn't been paranoid enough. The process server arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was drinking coffee on my deck, watching the sunrise over the ocean. He handed me a thick manila envelope, had me sign for it, and left me standing there with my heart pounding as I opened documents that would change everything. Gerald Morrison and Constance Morrison versus Marlene Morrison, filed in Los Angeles County Superior Court. They were suing me for 50% ownership of my villa. As I read through page after page of legal language, the scope of their betrayal became clear. This wasn't just a random lawsuit. This was a carefully constructed attack designed to destroy me and take everything I'd built. Their claims were breathtaking in their audacity and completely fabricated lies. They alleged that during my childhood, they'd provided unpaid childcare consultation and emotional support services worth hundreds of thousands of dollars that I now owed them. They claimed that I'd used family connections and resources to build my business, despite the fact that I'd cut them off for years and built Neural Wave entirely on my own. They stated that they'd co-signed student loans for my education, a complete lie since I'd had a full scholarship and had never needed loans. But the most insidious claim was their argument that the villa should be considered family property because they were my parents and had contributed to the success that allowed the purchase. It was legal nonsense, but it was wrapped in language designed to make me look like an ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned her struggling family. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely function as the reality sank in. My own parents were willing to lie under oath, to commit what amounted to fraud, just to take my home away from me. I hired Genevieve Crawford, one of the top family law attorneys in Los Angeles, on Vincent's recommendation. Genevieve was a sharp woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair and eyes that could cut through lies like a scalpel. She reviewed the lawsuit in her office while I sat across from her, shaking. When she looked up, her expression was grim. "This is absurd and won't hold up in court, but I need to be honest with you, Marlene. They're playing extremely dirty, and they've hired Randall Pierce." That name meant nothing to me, so she explained. Pierce is a notoriously ruthless family attorney who specializes in finding loopholes and manipulating emotions in court. He takes cases like this because he gets a percentage of whatever he wins. Has going to make this ugly. The first court hearing was 3 weeks later, and it was worse than anything Genevieve had prepared me for. I sat in that courtroom watching my parents take the stand and lie with such convincing emotion that I almost doubted my own memories. My father testified that I'd been a cold, difficult child, who'd always resented my sister's warmth and charm. He claimed they'd sacrificed constantly to support my education, taking out loans and working extra jobs, none of which was true. My mother cried actual tears as she described how I'd cut them off after they'd given me everything, how I'd flaunted my wealth while they struggled to help Bethany raise her children. The lies flowed so smoothly, so convincingly, that I saw the judge's expression softening with sympathy. Then Bethany took the stand, and her performance was worthy of an award. She wore a simple dress that made her look struggling and humble, and she cried as she talked about how much Shed looked up to me as a child, how Shed tried so hard to have a relationship with me, but I'd always hated her for being loved by our parents. "Marlene always had everything," she sobbed. "She's brilliant and successful, and I'm so proud of her. But she's used her success to punish us for not being perfect parents. That beautiful house sits mostly empty, while my children share bedrooms in our tiny apartment. I'm not asking for anything for myself. I just want my kids to have opportunities." It was a masterful manipulation, painting me as the villain and her as the suffering sister just wanting fairness. I watched the judge's face during her testimony, and my stomach dropped. He was buying it. Every word of their lies was landing exactly as they'd intended. When Genevieve cross-examined them, pointing out inconsistencies and asking for proof of their claims, Randall Pierce objected constantly, and the judge sustained most of his objections. We left that first hearing with Genevieve's warning ringing in my ears. The judge is sympathetic to them. We need to build a stronger defense, and we need it fast. But the damage was already spreading beyond the courtroom. Somehow, the media had caught wind of the case, and tabloid headlines started appearing. Tech millionaire refuses to share fortune with struggling family. Daughters, greed leaves parents homeless. The court of public opinion was turning against me before I'd even had a chance to tell my side. The hate mail started arriving within days. Hundreds of messages calling me selfish, greedy, a disgrace to family values. People who knew nothing about my history with my parents were sending death threats because the tabloid version of the story painted me as a monster. My business contacts started distancing themselves, not wanting to be associated with the negative publicity. Investors I'd been talking to about new ventures suddenly stopped returning my calls. Vincent stood by me, but even he looked worried. "This could destroy your reputation permanently," he warned. "Even if you win in court, the damage might be irreversible." I felt like I was drowning, being pulled under by lies and manipulation, and I didn't know how to fight back against people who had no conscience about destroying their own daughter for money. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my parents launched their second attack. I was served with notice that Gerald and Constance had filed a police report claiming I'd stolen family heirlooms, specifically my grandmother's jewelry collection that had been legally left to me in her will. They claimed the jewelry was family property that I'd taken without permission when I'd left for college, and they wanted it returned or they'd press charges for theft. The police actually showed up at my villa with a warrant to search for the jewelry, and I had to stand there, humiliated, while officers went through my personal belongings, looking for items that were rightfully mine. I showed them the documentation, my grandmother's will that clearly stated the jewelry was mine, but the officers said they still had to complete the search because a report had been filed. The whole thing was designed not to actually get the jewelry back but to humiliate me and create more negative press. And it worked perfectly. Within hours, there were new headlines. Police investigate Tech Harris for theft of family jewels. The articles painted a picture of me as someone so greedy I'd stolen from my dying grandmother, when the truth was the exact opposite. Those pieces of jewelry were the only physical connection I had to the one person in my family who truly loved me, and my parents were trying to use them as weapons against me. I nearly broke. I sat in my villa, this beautiful space that was supposed to represent my success and freedom, and I felt like a prisoner under siege. The walls felt like they were closing in as I read comment after comment from strangers who believed I was a monster. Vincent found me on the deck, staring at the ocean with a bottle of wine, seriously considering just giving my parents the house to make all of this stop. He physically took the wine from my hands and made me look at him. "That's exactly what they want," he said firmly. "They want you to be so beaten down that you just hand over everything you've worked for. You can't let them win, Marlene. You can't." But I felt so alone in this fight, so overwhelmed by the machinery of their lies and manipulation. That's when something unexpected happened. I received a call from a number I didn't recognize, and a man's voice said, "Marlene, this is your Uncle Fletcher. We've never met, but I'm your father's brother, and I need to talk to you about what Gerald and Constance are doing to you. I have information that can help." I was immediately suspicious. Why would another family member suddenly appear offering to help? But Fletcher insisted on meeting in person, so I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop with Genevieve present, just in case this was another trap. Fletcher Morrison was in his early 60s, with kind eyes that reminded me painfully of my grandmother, his mother. He sat across from me and Genevieve, and the first thing he said was, "I'm so sorry for what my brother is doing to you. I want you to know that this is a pattern with Gerald and Constance, and you're not the first person they've financially manipulated." Over the next 2 hours, Fletcher laid out a family history I'd never known existed. He pulled out documents, bank records, and legal papers showing that 15 years ago, Gerald and Constance had convinced Fletcher's ex-wife during their divorce to give them her settlement money, promising to invest it for her. They'd never paid back a single dollar, and when Shed threatened to sue, they'd turn the family against her, calling her greedy and unstable until Shed given up. He showed me evidence that they'd manipulated elderly relatives out of inheritance money, always with promises to help manage it that turned into outright theft. He revealed that my grandmother had actually left a much larger inheritance than I'd known about, but Gerald and Constance had been trustees and had somehow made most of it disappear, claiming expenses and debts that Fletcher's investigation proved were fabricated. Your grandmother knew what they were, Fletcher said quietly. She tried to protect you by setting up that college fund separately, but they got to that too. She died knowing her son was a thief, and it broke her heart. Hearing that my grandmother had known about their true nature, but hadn't been able to stop them, made something crack inside me. Fletcher also brought information about Bethany and Trevor that explained so much. Trevor wasn't just an unemployed musician. He was a gambling addict who'd run up over $300,000 in debts to some very dangerous people. Bethany had been using credit cards to keep their family afloat, and they were drowning in interest payments. They needed money desperately, and my villa represented a lifeline. If they could force me to sell it or give them half ownership, they could pay off their debts and have enough left over to live on for years. This was never about family or fairness, Fletcher said. This is about Gerald and Constance seeing an opportunity to make money off you and helping Bethany solve her financial crisis at the same time. You're just a resource to them, not a daughter. Fletcher offered to testify in court, to bring all his documentation and evidence of my parents' history of financial manipulation. He also offered something else: the contact information for 3 other people my parents had scammed over the years, who were willing to testify about the pattern of behavior. Genevieve's eyes lit up as she reviewed Fletcher's evidence. This changes everything, she said. We can establish a pattern of fraudulent behavior. We can show the judge that their claims aren't isolated mistakes, but part of a long history of exploiting family members for money. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a spark of hope. I wasn't alone anymore. I had an ally who understood what I was dealing with, and we had evidence that could fight back against their lies. But I had no idea how much uglier this was about to get before it got better. My parents weren't done escalating. 2 weeks after Fletcher came into my life, my lawyer called with news that made my blood run cold. Gerald and Constance had filed an emergency injunction to freeze my assets, claiming I was preparing to flee the country with money that rightfully belonged to the family. It was complete fabrication, but Randall Pierce had presented the motion with such urgency that a judge had granted a temporary freeze until a hearing could be held. For 2 weeks, I couldn't access my own bank accounts, couldn't pay my bills, couldn't even buy groceries with my own money. I had to borrow from Vincent to pay Genevieve's legal fees and keep my utilities on. The humiliation was crushing. Here I was, a successful entrepreneur who'd built a multi-million-dollar company, and I couldn't access my own money because my parents had convinced a judge I was a flight risk. Every day of those 2 weeks, I felt more powerless, more trapped by their manipulation. But the psychological warfare didn't stop there. My parents agreed to do an interview with a local news station, and I watched in horror as they sat on the couch in Bethany's tiny apartment, surrounded by her children, playing the role of suffering, abandoned parents with Academy Award-worthy skill. Constance cried on camera as she talked about how much they loved me, how they'd sacrificed everything for my education and success, and how the money and fame had changed me into someone they didn't recognize. We're not asking for the world, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. We just want our daughter back. We want her to remember where she came from, to help family when they're struggling. That beautiful house sits empty most of the time, while Bethany's children share bedrooms. Is it really so wrong for a mother to want her children to treat each other fairly? Gerald sat beside her, looking tired and sad, the perfect image of a father wounded by his daughter's cruelty. We gave her life, he said quietly. We raised her, supported her, and now we're in our retirement years with nothing, while she lives in luxury and won't even return our calls. We're not asking for much, just what's fair. The interview went viral. Within 24 hours, I was receiving thousands of hateful messages across every social media platform. People called me every vile name imaginable, said I deserved to lose everything, that I was a disgrace to families everywhere. Someone created a hashtag, #Marlene Morrison is a monster, and it was trending. Complete strangers were making video responses, talking about how disgusted they were by my selfishness, how their parents had sacrificed for them and they couldn't imagine treating them this way. The court of public opinion had completely convicted me without knowing a single true fact about my history with my family. I stopped looking at social media, stopped reading the news, but I couldn't escape it completely. The damage was everywhere. My depression during this time became almost unbearable. I stopped eating regularly, lost 12 pounds in 3 weeks, and couldn't sleep more than 2 or 3 hours a night without waking up in panic. I stopped answering calls from everyone, except Vincent and Genevieve. The villa, my dream home, started to feel like a prison. Every room reminded me of what I was about to lose, and I couldn't enjoy a single moment of peace. Genevieve warned me repeatedly that the judge was buying their performance, that we needed something dramatic to turn the case around, but I felt like we were fighting against an avalanche with a spoon. Then came the breaking point. I returned home one evening after a particularly brutal deposition, where Randall Pierce had spent 4 hours attacking my character, asking invasive questions about my personal life, my relationships, trying to paint me as cold and selfish. I pulled into my driveway and immediately knew something was wrong. The front door was slightly open, and as I walked closer, I saw it. Words spray painted across my beautiful glass entryway in red paint: selfish daughter, family stealer. You don't deserve this. Every window on the first floor was smashed. Inside, furniture was overturned, cushions slashed, pictures torn off walls and destroyed. Someone had methodically vandalized my home, and when I checked the security system, I discovered the cameras had mysteriously been shut off during the exact time the vandalism occurred. I called the police, and they filed a report, but there was no evidence of who'd done it. I had my suspicions. Trevor had technical skills, and the timing was too convenient. This happened right after Eid refused another settlement offer from my parents' lawyer. But I couldn't prove anything, and the police treated it as random vandalism despite the very specific messages painted on my door. That night, sitting in my destroyed home, surrounded by broken glass and ruined furniture, I collapsed. Vincent found me on the floor of my living room, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe, and I told him what I'd been thinking for days. I can't do this anymore. Maybe I should just give up. Maybe they're right and I'm a terrible person who doesn't deserve any of this. Maybe I should just let them have it all and disappear. Vincent grabbed my shoulders and made me look at him, and his voice was fiercer than I'd ever heard it. Listen to me, Marlene. You've fought too hard, overcome too much, to let these toxic people destroy you. They vandalized your house because they're desperate, because they know we're building a case against them, and they're trying to break you before we can present it. You are not giving up. We're going to end this, and we're going to win. But I need you to hold on just a little bit longer. Can you do that for me? I didn't feel like I could, but I nodded anyway because the alternative was letting them win. And some stubborn part of me refused to give them that satisfaction. I didn't know it then, but we were about to turn this whole nightmare around in a way they never saw coming. Over the next week, Genevieve, Vincent, Fletcher, and I developed a plan that was risky but potentially brilliant. We would give my parents exactly what they thought they wanted, lure them into a false sense of victory, and let their own arrogance destroy them. The plan hinged on California's laws about recording conversations on your own property, which are legal as long as the property owner is aware of the recording. I had every legal right to wire my own home with cameras and audio, and that's exactly what we did. We brought in a professional security company and installed hidden cameras and microphones throughout the villa, focused particularly on the living room and dining area where we'd stage our meeting. Then I made the call that almost killed me to make. I dialed my father's number, and when he answered with a smug, "Hello, Marlene," I forced my voice to sound broken and defeated. "Dad, you win. I can't do this anymore. The legal fees, the stress, the publicity, it's destroying me. I want to settle this out of court. I'll agree to sign over partial ownership of the villa. Can we meet here this weekend to work out the details and sign papers? I just want this to be over." The silence on the other end was brief, and then I heard the triumph in his voice. "I think that's very mature of you, sweetheart. We never wanted to hurt you. We just wanted what's fair. Of course we'll come this weekend. I'll bring our lawyer." I told him to leave Randall Pierce at home, that this would be just family, that I wanted to handle this personally and quietly. Surprisingly, he agreed, probably thinking that without their lawyer present, they could manipulate me more easily. When I hung up, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. Genevieve reviewed the plan one more time. They're going to come in confident, probably gloating. Your job is to seem defeated, to let them think they've won completely. People get careless when they think they've already won. Let them talk. Let them reveal their real intentions. We need them to incriminate themselves on camera. It sounded simple in theory, but I knew that sitting across from my parents while they gloated about destroying me was going to be one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Saturday arrived, and with it came my entire family. Gerald and Constance showed up with Bethany and Trevor, all of them walking into my villa with barely concealed excitement. I played my role perfectly, greeting them with tired eyes and a defeated posture, offering coffee with shaking hands. We sat in the living room, papers spread out on the coffee table, and I began the performance of my life. I've thought a lot about what you said, about family and fairness. I began, my voice quiet. Maybe you're right. Maybe I have been selfish. This house is too big for just me, and Bethany's children would love it here. I just want this fighting to stop. I just want peace. I saw the looks they exchanged, the satisfaction in their eyes. Gerald leaned back on my couch, and his whole demeanor changed from concerned father to predator Hod cornered his prey. I'm glad you're finally seeing sense, Marlene. This is what family does. We support each other. But then his mask started to slip, and the cruelty underneath began to show. You know, this house really is wasted on you. You don't have a family, no husband, no kids. What do you even do here all alone? Bethany can actually fill this place with life. Bethany jumped in, her fake sweetness gone, replaced with the entitled bitterness I remembered from childhood. Finally, well, get what we deserve. My kids need space to grow, and this place is perfect. Plus, the location is incredible. We could not afford anything like this on our own. Then Trevor, who'd been quiet until now, made the first critical mistake. We can flip this for $3 million easy, pay off everything and still have plenty left over. Gerald shot him a look, but the damage was done, and now the greed was flowing freely. My mother, Constance, was the one who delivered the line that made my blood run cold. She looked directly at me, and all pretense of motherly love vanished from her face. You always were the stupid one, Marlene. Honestly, did you actually think we loved you? Did you think this whole reconciliation was real? She laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off my walls. We haven't loved you since you were born. You were difficult, demanding, nothing like the daughter we wanted. When Bethany came along, perfect and beautiful, we finally had the child Wed dreamed of. You were just the mistake we had to tolerate. Gerald nodded, adding his own venom to the wound. Everything you have should have been Bethany's. You took resources that should have gone to her, attention that should have been hers. This lawsuit is just correcting the cosmic injustice of you existing. They were so caught up in their victory, so confident, that they'd broken me, that they started confessing everything. Bethany admitted they'd planned the lawsuit before the Thanksgiving visit, that the whole reconciliation had been a setup to gather information and make me vulnerable. Trevor casually mentioned that he'd been the one to vandalize the house, laughing about how easy it had been to disable my security system because I'd trusted them enough to give them the alarm code during their visit. Constance revealed that they'd paid two of their friends to pose as former colleagues of mine and provide false testimony about my character. People who'd testify that I'd always been ruthless and selfish in business. Gerald explained how Randall Pierce had donated to the judge's campaign fund years ago, how they'd specifically chosen this judge because they knew he'd be sympathetic to parents over a successful daughter. And then Bethany, in a moment of pure spite, brought up the college fund, that money from Grandma that we borrowed, she said with air quotes and a smirk. We never planned to pay it back. What were you going to do about it? You were just a kid. That money paid for my wedding and our honeymoon to Bali. Thanks for that, sis. I sat there, maintaining my defeated expression while inside. I was screaming with rage and vindication. They'd confessed to everything. Fraud, conspiracy, extortion, vandalism, perjury, all captured on camera and audio with crystal clarity. They were so confident in their victory that they were signing the settlement papers with smiles on their faces, Bethany already making plans about which bedroom would be whose. Gerald was about to sign the final document when I spoke up, my voice still quiet. Just one more signature needed to make this official, I said. From my lawyer. I stood up and walked to the door, opening it to reveal Genevieve standing there with two police officers behind her. The look on my parents' faces was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Confusion, then understanding, then pure panic as Genevieve announced in her crisp legal voice. Gerald Morrison, Constance Morrison, Bethany Walker, and Trevor Walker, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, and perjury. Everything you said in the last hour has been recorded and will be used as evidence against you. Officers, please. The police moved in, and the villa that had been filled with my family's gloating laughter suddenly erupted into chaos as they realized they'd walked into a trap of their own making. My mother started screaming that it was entrapment, that they'd been coerced. My father's face turned purple with rage as he lunged toward me, stopped by an officer's hand. Bethany and Trevor were trying to run, but there was nowhere to go. As they were led out in handcuffs, my mother turned to me with such hatred in her eyes that it actually made me take a step back. You'll regret this, she hissed. We're your family. Blood is blood. You'll never escape what you are. But I looked right back at her, and for the first time in my life, I felt no fear of her judgment. You stopped being my family the moment you decided I was worth less than money, I said quietly, and the only thing I regret is wasting so many years hoping you'd love me. I watched them being put into police cars, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt free. The emergency court hearing was scheduled within a week, and the courtroom was packed with media, curious onlookers, and people who'd been following the case. This time, though, the narrative was completely different. Genevieve stood before the judge with a laptop and stacks of evidence, and she methodically destroyed every single claim my parents had made. She played the audio recordings of their confessions, and the courtroom went silent as everyone heard Gerald and Constance admit they'd never loved me, that the lawsuit was a calculated attack, that they'd manipulated evidence and witnesses. She showed the video footage of Trevor admitting to the vandalism, of Bethany confessing to the planned fraud. Randall Pierce tried to object, tried to claim the recordings were obtained illegally, but Genevieve was prepared for every argument. She cited California law, showed the documentation that I had every right to record conversations in my own home, and presented the signed affidavit that I'd been present and aware of all recordings. The judge's face grew darker with each piece of evidence. When Genevieve presented Uncle Fletcher's testimony about my parents' history of financial manipulation, complete with documentation of at least 4 other people they'd scammed over the years, the judge actually interrupted. "Counselor Pierce, did you know about your client's history of fraud when you took this case?" Randall Pierce stammered, tried to claim he'd believed his clients, but it was clear he was drowning. Then Genevieve dropped the biggest revelation, one that Fletcher had uncovered just days before. She presented a letter, yellowed with age, written in my grandmother's handwriting. It was dated 2 months before she died, addressed to me, and it had never been delivered. In the letter, my grandmother wrote that she knew Gerald and Constance were manipulative people who saw family members as resources rather than people to love. She wrote that she was setting up a trust fund for me, separate from what my parents could access, because she wanted to ensure I'd have support when I needed it. The trust was supposed to contain over $400,000, money Shed saved throughout her life specifically for my education and future. But the trust documents Fletcher presented showed something sickening. Gerald and Constance, as executors of her estate, had intercepted the letter and forged documentation to make themselves beneficiaries of the trust. They'd drained every penny within 6 months of her death, using the money for renovations to their house and a new car. My grandmother's final gift to me, her last message of love from the only family member who'd ever truly cared about me, had been stolen and hidden. As Genevieve read portions of the letter aloud in court, my grandmother's words about believing in me and knowing I'd do great things, I felt tears streaming down my face. Not just for the money they'd stolen, but for the fact that even in death, they'd taken away her voice, her love, her final attempt to protect me. The judge looked at my parents with such disgust that even from across the courtroom I could feel the weight of his judgment. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," he said, his voice hard as steel. "In 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such calculated cruelty toward one's own child. You didn't just lie to this court. You orchestrated a campaign of emotional and financial abuse designed to destroy your daughter's life for monetary gain. You violated her trust, manipulated evidence, committed perjury, and showed absolutely no remorse for your actions." He turned to Randall Pierce. "And Mr. Pierce, I suggest you be very careful about which clients you choose to represent in the future. This court does not look kindly on attorneys who enable fraud." The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. My parents were ordered to pay all of my legal fees, which had exceeded $300,000. A restraining order was immediately issued, requiring Gerald, Constance, Bethany, and Trevor to stay at least 500 feet away from me at all times, and the criminal charges would proceed. The district attorney's office had already indicated they'd be pursuing fraud, identity theft for the credit cards that opened in my name, vandalism, conspiracy, and perjury charges. The judge recommended maximum sentences given the deliberate and malicious nature of their crimes. As the judge delivered his ruling, I watched my parents' faces crumble. The confidence and smugness were gone, replaced by the realization that they'd destroyed themselves. Officers moved forward to take them into custody right there in the courtroom since they'd violated the terms of their previous bail by attempting to contact me through a third party. Bethany started screaming, her composure completely shattered. "This is your fault, Marlene," she shrieked as officers restrained her. You ruined our family. We needed that money. My children needed that house. You're a monster. But her words bounced off me like rain off glass. I felt nothing but relief. Fletcher sat beside me, and as the courtroom cleared, he put his hand on my shoulder. Your grandmother would be so proud of you, he said quietly. She always knew you were strong enough to survive them. That's why she tried so hard to protect you. 3 months later, Gerald and Constance were each sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for fraud and identity theft. Bethany and Trevor received probation, community service, and were ordered to pay restitution for their role in the conspiracy. Randall Pierce faced an ethics investigation that would eventually result in his disbarment, and I stood in my villa, finally and truly mine, and began the long process of healing from wounds that had been inflicted over a lifetime. 3 months after the trial ended, I sat on the deck of my villa watching the sunset paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and pink, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt genuinely at peace. The legal nightmare was over. Gerald and Constance were serving their sentences in federal prison, and I'd received notification that they'd each been assigned to facilities in different states, far from California and far from me. Bethany and Trevor were struggling through their probation, and from what Fletcher told me, their marriage was falling apart under the weight of their financial problems and legal consequences. Part of me, a small part, felt a twinge of something that might have been pity, but mostly I felt relief that they could no longer hurt me. The healing process wasn't quick or easy. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma, and through our sessions, I began to understand that the voice in my head telling me I was worthless, that I deserved my parents' cruelty, wasn't my voice at all. It was theirs, implanted through years of emotional abuse and manipulation. Unlearning those thought patterns was hard work, but slowly, I started to see myself the way people like Vincent and Fletcher saw me, not as the disappointing daughter or the difficult child, but as someone who'd overcome incredible obstacles to build something meaningful. I was proud of myself, and that was a new feeling. Uncle Fletcher became a constant presence in my life, the family member I'd always needed but never had. He told me stories about my grandmother, memories I'd never heard, painting a picture of a woman who'd been strong and kind, and who'd seen through Gerald and Constance's masks, long before anyone else. She used to tell me, Fletcher said one afternoon as we walked along the beach, that you reminded her of herself. Quiet strength, intelligence that threatened insecure people, and a heart that loved deeply even when it had been hurt. She knew you'd need protection from your parents, and she tried to give it to you. I'm sorry we failed you. I told him he hadn't failed me, that by coming forward when he did, had given me the tools to save myself, and that was the greatest gift he could have offered. Vincent helped me rebuild my public image, not through denials or spin, but through truth. I wrote an op-ed for a major publication titled, When Family Becomes Predator, My Story of Surviving Parental Financial Abuse. In it, I detailed my experience without naming my parents specifically, talking about the patterns of manipulation, the golden child versus scapegoat dynamic, and the way family members can weaponize societal expectations about loyalty to justify exploitation. I wrote about how difficult it is to stand up to abusive parents in a culture that tells us we owe our parents everything, simply because they gave us life. The article went viral in a completely different way than the tabloid stories had. This time, I controlled the narrative, and the response was overwhelming. Thousands of people reached out to tell me their own stories of being financially or emotionally exploited by family members. Adult children who had been guilted into giving their parents money they couldn't afford. Siblings who'd been scapegoated while golden children were elevated. People had been told they were selfish for setting boundaries or protecting their own resources. I realized that my story wasn't unique. It was a pattern that played out in families across every culture and economic level. But nobody talked about it because the shame of admitting your own family hurt you was too great. Reading those messages, knowing I wasn't alone, was profoundly healing. That realization led me to turn my pain into purpose. I'd always wondered what I'd do with the wealth I'd accumulated, how I could make my success mean something beyond personal comfort. Now I knew. I established the Audrey Grace Foundation, named after my grandmother, with a mission to provide legal aid and support services for adult children being financially or emotionally exploited by family members. The foundation offered free legal consultations, connected victims with attorneys who understood family abuse dynamics, and provided therapy services for people working through the trauma of family betrayal. We also developed financial literacy programs to help people protect their assets from manipulative relatives. I poured over $2 million into getting the foundation up and running, hiring staff who were passionate about the mission and setting up offices in 3 major cities. The villa, which had been the symbol of everything my parents tried to take from me, became the foundation's event space. I hosted fundraisers on the deck overlooking the ocean, bringing together donors and advocates who believed in protecting vulnerable adults from family predators. Every time I stood in that space, surrounded by people committed to helping others, the painful memories of the lawsuit and the vandalism faded a little more. The house was being reclaimed for good, transformed from a site of trauma into a space of healing and purpose. Bethany sent me a letter from her probation officer's address about 6 months after the trial. It was 5 pages long, filled with apologies and explanations about how she'd been manipulated by our parents too, how she'd always loved me but didn't know how to show it, how she hoped someday I could forgive her. I read it once, sitting in my office, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no urge to respond. I folded it carefully and threw it in the recycling bin. Some relationships are too damaged to repair, too toxic to resurrect, and trying to salvage them would only hurt me again. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation, and I was learning to be okay with that. My parents never apologized, not that I expected them to. According to Fletcher, who occasionally got updates from distant relatives, Gerald and Constance spent their time in prison blaming me for everything that had happened to them. They told anyone who would listen that I was ungrateful, that I'd set them up, that they were the real victims. Even facing the consequences of their actions, they couldn't see themselves as anything but martyrs wronged by their selfish daughter. For a long time, that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I'd hoped that maybe losing everything would give them a moment of clarity, that they'd realize what they'd destroyed. But I came to understand that people like my parents don't change because they're fundamentally unable to see themselves clearly. Their egos won't allow them to accept responsibility for their cruelty. Making peace with that, with the fact that I'd never get the apology or acknowledgement I deserved, was part of my healing. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had real family now, chosen family that I'd built from people who valued me. Fletcher became like the father I'd never had, cheering on my foundation work and being genuinely proud of my accomplishments. Vincent remained my closest friend, the brother I'd always wanted, celebrating my victories and supporting me through setbacks. Genevieve became a trusted advisor and friend, joining the foundation's board and helping us navigate complex legal issues. These were the people who saw my worth, who chose to be in my life, and their love meant more than anything my biological family had ever offered. 1 year after the trial, I hosted a gala at the villa for the Audrey Grace Foundation. 50 people attended, each of them someone whose life had been changed by our work. There was Juliana, a woman in her 50s who'd finally escaped her mother's financial control after 40 years of manipulation. There was Marcus, a young man who'd been disowned by his family for refusing to hand over his inheritance to his gambling-addicted father, who our foundation had helped through the legal battle. There were attorneys, therapists, donors, and volunteers, all gathered on my deck as the sun set over the Pacific, all committed to making sure other people didn't have to suffer alone the way we had. I gave a speech that night that I'd written and rewritten a dozen times, trying to find the right words to express what this work meant to me. They tried to take my home, I began, looking out at the faces of people who understood. My parents sued me for this villa because they believed I didn't deserve it, that everything I'd built belonged to them simply because they'd given birth to me. They tried to use the legal system, public opinion, and emotional manipulation to break me down until I handed over everything I'd worked for. And for a while, I almost let them win, because I'd been conditioned my entire life to believe I was worth less than I was. I paused, feeling the weight of those words. But this villa isn't just mine anymore. It belongs to all of us who survived family betrayal and came out stronger. This foundation, this community, is proof that we don't have to accept abuse just because it comes from people who share our DNA. We can build new families, healthier families, based on mutual respect and genuine love. The applause that followed was overwhelming, but what moved me most was the feeling of belonging I felt in that moment. These people understood my story because they'd lived versions of it themselves. They didn't judge me for cutting off my parents, or think I was selfish for protecting what was mine. They celebrated my strength, and in turn, I celebrated theirs. That night, standing in the home I'd fought so hard to keep, surrounded by people who chose to love me, I realized I'd finally found what I'd been searching for my entire life. Not my parents' approval, but my own peace. I started writing a memoir about 6 months after the gala, partly as therapy, and partly because so many people had asked me to share my full story. I worked on it in the early mornings, sitting on my deck with coffee as the sun rose over the ocean, and the process of putting everything into words was both painful and cathartic. I wrote about the little girl Hode waited for birthday cakes that never came. The teenager Hode worked 3 jobs to escape. The young woman Hode built an empire alone, and the survivor who'd fought her own family in court, and won. The working title was The Price of Being Unloved. But as I wrote the final chapters, I realized that wasn't my story anymore. I'd spent so much of my life focused on the love I didn't receive, that I'd almost missed the love I'd found. I changed the title to The Freedom of Letting Go, and it felt right in a way the original never had. This wasn't a story about what my parents did to me. It was about what I did for myself despite them. It was about learning that family isn't defined by blood, but by choice, by the people who show up for you when you need them, who celebrate your victories and support you through defeats. It was about understanding that protecting yourself from toxic people isn't selfish, it's survival, and that sometimes the greatest act of love you can show yourself is walking away from people who don't value you. The book is scheduled to publish next year, and proceeds will go directly to the Audrey Grace Foundation to expand our services. Vincent jokes that I'm going to be on talk shows and book tours, sharing my story with even more people, and the idea both terrifies and excites me. But I'm ready for it now in a way I wouldn't have been even a year ago. I'm ready to stand up and say that what happened to me wasn't okay, that children don't owe their parents unlimited access to their resources or tolerance of abuse, and that it's possible to build a beautiful life, even after your family tries to destroy you. As I finish writing this, sitting in the office of my villa, with the ocean breeze coming through the open window, I find myself thinking about that moment in the courtroom when the judge asked my parents why they'd done what they did to me. My mother had looked at him and said, without a trace of shame, "She owed us. We gave her life." But she was wrong. They gave me birth, which is biology, not love. Life, real life, filled with purpose and joy, and genuine connection, that's something I gave myself. I built it from the ground up when they left me with nothing but wounds and rejection, and nobody can ever take that away from me. So here's what I want to know from all of you watching this. Have you ever had to set boundaries with toxic family members? Have you struggled with the guilt of protecting yourself from people you're supposed to love unconditionally? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I read every single one and your stories matter. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel because sharing these experiences helps all of us feel less alone. And if you know someone who's dealing with family exploitation or manipulation, share this video with them. Sometimes just knowing that someone else survived and came out stronger is enough to give people hope to keep fighting. Thank you for listening to my story, for being part of this community, and for understanding that family should be defined by love and respect, not obligation and guilt. I wish you all the strength to protect your peace, the courage to walk away from people who hurt you, and the wisdom to build families that celebrate who you are, rather than punish you for not being who they wanted. You deserve love that doesn't come with conditions, and you deserve a life that's truly yours. Never forget that.